Welcome to another episode of the Coaster101 Podcast. I am Eric Woolley, and this week I am joined by one of Coaster101's Ohio writers and our resident engineering expert, Nick Weisenberger. So all year on the site, we have been sort of running weekly features focusing on rides celebrating their 20th anniversaries in 2020. And recently, Nick, you did a really deep dive and long feature about maybe the best known of those year 2000 coasters, Millennium Force. So Nick is joining us today to sort of get into some of that history of Millennium Force, and then also we'll talk about sort of its legacy and its popularity these days and what people like or don't like about it. Thank you very much for joining us, Nick.
No problem. Thanks for having me back on again. A second time on the podcast.
I know. It's always, and talking again about Ohio Giga Coasters, right?
Yeah. We talked about Orion, so here we are again.
Yeah. So maybe let's, if people haven't read the article, they should, but maybe let's talk about the beginning. So Millennium Force, it opened in 2000, and you did a whole bunch of research on this, I think, looking through old articles and books about Cedar Point. Where did am I right that 2000 was that like the peak of sort of the roller coaster wars kind of time period?
Yeah, I think so, because that's when you had like Six Flags Magic Mountain was building a ton of coasters. You had Six Flags Worlds of Adventure here in Ohio building 4 new coasters. So yeah, I think it's safe to say that's definitely the height of the coaster wars. So
I mean, obviously, like Millennium Force, when it breaks a bunch of records, at least right when it opens.
Yeah.
Did you find, so where did the ideas for Millennium Force, when was Cedar Point started, when did they start thinking about it, and did they already know, like back then, that they wanted it to be the 300-foot coaster?
When we talk about the history of Millennium Force, I think we actually have to go back and start first with 1989 with Magnum XL200.
Yeah.
Which was the first roller coaster to break the 200-foot barrier, a term they then used to describe what was a hypercoaster.
Yeah.
So that was at Cedar Point in 1989. That was built by Aerodynamics. And like the plan for that was essentially make like a giant wooden roller coaster, because I think a lot of the steel coasters at the time were more focused on inversions and loops and things like that.
Yeah. You were getting to like the B&M inverted coasters and stand-ups that had all of these loops in them, right?
So Cedar Point builds that, and then they go on and they build one of the biggest wooden coasters, Beam Streak, in 91. They build a record-breaking inverted coaster, Raptor, in 1994. And then they built Mantis, record-breaking stand-up coaster by B&M in 96. So after that, I think everybody was wondering, okay, what's next? Because Cedar Point was then known for, building record-breaking roller coasters.
Yeah.
But then before that, Cedar Fair as a chain as a whole, they wanted to build on the success of Magnum and to kind of copy that same plan of building a hypercoaster at other parks. So that's where they built Wild Thing at Valley Fair, Steel Force at Dorney Park, and Mamba at Worlds of Fun.
Yeah.
And so they changed manufacturers to Morgan Manufacturing, which I think was actually made up of some old Aero employees.
That sounds right to me, because I remember that, and I don't remember when Morgan and Chance came together, but I remember at one point they had offices out here in California where Aero had originally been as well. And so all 3 of those hypercoasters, Wild Thing, Mamba, and Steel Force, those are all Morgan coasters, right?
Yep.
So that was all like mid 90s era.
Yep, I think the last one was 98 or 99, somewhere in there. Yeah, so it's the second half of the 90s. So that was just building a big steel coaster, really tall with no inversions, was just a formula for success that Cedar Fair had. So I think it was probably around 97 or 98 when they started thinking about going even higher to 300 feet. And what we do know for sure is in the book Always Cedar Point by John Hildebrandt, he says there was the new coaster was pitched to the board of directors in Cleveland in November of 1998. And so that they had the same plan at the time where they wanted to have a steel structure, steel track, no inversions, high capacity, and world record-breaking ride.
So then you talk a little bit about this. So they had been they had been using Morgan to build all of their hyper coasters, but then it sounded like they kind of, when they started to pitch the idea of the ride, it sounds like it sort of came down to two. Morgan was in the running for building Millennium Force, right? And then it was them and Intamin who ended up actually building it. Can you tell us a little bit about how sort of what the do we know what the proposals from the two of them were, and why Cedar Point ended up actually going with Intamin to build Millennium Force? Yeah,
a little bit. First, in John Hildebrand's book, he does say that B&M was not actually considered as one of the companies to build the coaster, because you have to think at that time they hadn't yet built a hyper coaster. All their coasters were pretty much, inverting coasters.
Yeah,
went upside down, giant loops. So I mean, maybe
I'm trying to think of B&M. Did they even have a sit-down coaster at that point? The stand-ups and the inverted.
Yeah, I think
starting on floorless, right?
Every single one of their coasters probably went upside down at that point.
Yeah,
but I don't, probably little known to Cedar Fair, maybe they didn't know, but they were working on at the time Apollo's Chariot and Raging Bull, which were their first hyper coasters that would open in 1999. But he also says that they were committed to a couple new projects as well, so they wouldn't have been able to probably get it open in 2000, since they opened, I think, 6 other coasters that year. But it's kind of funny though, because we all know that later on, eventually, B&M becomes the Giga Coaster manufacturer of choice for Cedar Fair, having built 3 of them now.
Yeah, and that their hyper coasters are all over. I don't know how many they have, but it feels like they have a ton of hyper coasters that do exactly that model, like big hills, no loops kind of thing.
Yep, and at least 3 of the parks have a B&M hyper and a B&M Giga.
So B&M not considered for maybe multiple reasons. I mean, it does seem like they maybe had a full plate, even if Cedar Fair did know that it was something they'd done. So Morgan, I assume that they had talked to, because they had a bunch of experience with Morgan, right?
Yep. Yeah. So there's a I don't know if you ever listened to the Season Pass podcast.
Sure.
Which is a really great podcast, especially if you're interested in getting a career in theme park design. They have a lot of great episodes with interviewing theme park professionals like Imagineering legend Tony Baxter, people like that. And so in episode number 389, they actually interviewed Dana Morgan of Morgan Manufacturing. And according to him in this interview, he thought it was basically a done deal that Morgan was going to make Millennium Force based on their previous experience with Cedar Fair.
So why did that not work out?
I think one reason was cost. So Intamin had a cheaper ride, and I think part of that was because it was probably a shorter ride. At least that's how Morgan describes Intamin's design as having too much energy coming into the station. They just put a bunch of brakes at the end to scrub it off.
I saw that. I read that in the article, and I feel like we're going to discuss that when we talk about the ride experience later.
And if you listen to the interview, he sounds a little bitter that they didn't get to make Millennium Force, but because I think they also kind of don't. I think he doesn't want to admit the other reason why it seems like Intamin was chosen was mostly technology.
So what was it about what was the biggest breakthrough that Intamin had?
I think the main reason I think Intamin was chosen over Morgan was basically the lift hill. Morgan couldn't figure out how to get the cars to the top of the 300-foot summit quickly enough, and there was also a space issue. So if Morgan's was just going to do the same thing, which they eventually did on Seal Dragon 2000, was just to use 2 chains. So instead of one giant chain that would be really heavy, they just broke it up into 2. But the lift hill still would have been at the same 30 or 35 degree angle. Would have taken up a lot of space. So then Intamin was the one that had the more creative solution, the cable lift, where you have a cable that's essentially being wound up on a giant drum, and using elevator technology. So then that way the lift hill angle could be steepened to 45 degrees to take up less room. And you could get to the top of the hill in 20 seconds instead of
run
a minute. I think
much faster.
I think it takes Magnum over a minute to get to the top of the hill, and that's only 200 feet tall.
Got it. So a good chance that the cable lift, which I think I certainly love cable lifts. It's my favorite reason that some of Intamin's rides are my favorites, is thanks to the cable lift.
Sky Rush at Hershey Park, like getting
and El Toro. I think the first time I went on El Toro and like I had no idea it had a cable lift and was like, oh, this is awesome.
Yeah.
So that's that interesting that innovation, and it's, I assume that the reason is basically like to if Cedar Fair, one of the things that they wanted was really high capacity.
Yeah.
Being able to get if the cable lift takes the length of the ride to return to the station, then it's you can't really dispatch that quickly.
Yeah.
So Cedar Point, then they decide to go with Intamin on that, and then I guess maybe we can talk a little bit about. So obviously that worked. At least the cable lift aspect worked out.
And it would have been really awesome to see the design that Morgan came up with. I'm sure it would have looked a lot like Steel Dragon 2000 or some of the other hyper coasters they've done, but it would still be really interesting to see like what that proposal would have been. Like, would it have, if the lift hill was bigger and more drawn out, would have extended over like the River Rapids ride that's over there? Like, would they have had to remove another ride to fit it?
Yeah,
it'd be really interesting to see.
I assume, and on that episode of Season Pass Podcast, I assume Morgan doesn't have a set of blueprints from their proposal or something lying around he shared with anyone.
Yeah, he probably does, but he didn't share. But he did say that their ride would have been better. And he claimed someone from Cedar Fair told him that as well.
Interesting. Well, so I mean, you've mentioned Steel Dragon 2000, so I think we could. So Millennium Force, it opens. Which day did it actually open?
So they started construction in '99. They announced it on June 2nd or June 22nd, 1999. Construction really began in August and took about 9 months. That included the relocation of the giant wheel, the giant Ferris wheel over to where it is now. So they began testing in April of 2000, and it opened to media on May 11th. And then they was closed for a day to give maintenance and operations a day to recover after that. And then it officially opened to the public on May 13th. And at that time...
Did everything work on its opening day? I mean, you were in Ohio at the time, right?
As far as I know the first time I tried to ride it later that summer, we waited in line for a couple hours and then it broke down and we never got to ride it that day.
So some things with new coasters don't change very much.
It was okay, but then I believe the cable lift broke like at the end of the season on Labor Day because the Intamin thought it would last through 2 seasons, and it didn't even make it through one.
That is, well, I mean, a part of the gamble of going with a new piece of technology on the ride. So it opens in May 2000, and it breaks first full circuit coaster to hit 300 feet, right? Tallest coaster in the world, longest drop.
Yep.
I think it's got fastest closed circuit, I think, and a bunch of other records.
And you have to be very careful on the wording of these of the records when you're talking about roller coaster records, because there's always some like keyword that separates it from like, oh, it's the first full circuit, not just first coaster, but the first full circuit coaster to hit 300.
And then we mentioned Steel Dragon 2000, so Millennium Force breaks all these records. And then Steel Dragon 2000, which is at Nagashima Spa Land in Japan. If people aren't familiar with it, since it's less well known probably than Millennium Force, at least to Americans. It opens like a couple months later?
August 1st, 2000.
So breaks a whole bunch of those records that Millennium Force had just set, right?
Yep, exactly. So I mean, Morgan had already done a lot of research and design development on building a massive 300-foot tall coaster. So when they lost the bid to Cedar Point, they basically turned around and built a bigger ride for the Japanese. And because they had worked on the Cedar Point one, I think they had a pretty good idea of how tall they needed to make it in order to break the records.
Did Cedar Point and Morgan never work, or Cedar Fair and Morgan never work on another ride after this? I feel like this probably led to some tension between them.
Yeah, no, not that I recall.
So that's like, I assume that Cedar Fair after that. I mean, you mentioned, I guess Morgan on the episode of the podcast, Morgan mentions that Cedar Fair was a little hot after that.
Yeah, they're probably not too happy about that.
Yeah, But I mean, it makes sense, right? I mean, if they're going to go through the process of making a proposal for a big, doing the proposal and coming up with solutions to problems like having a double chain lift instead of a single.
Yep, and making the wheels larger, making the rails or the spine of the track bigger. Things like that.
So I assume that it doesn't seem surprising they would turn around and try and sell it to someone else.
Yeah. But we also have to remember, too, that Intamin only built one other Giga Coaster for Cedar Fair as well, and then they would turn around and went to B&M.
Right. So
even though they built two, it's like...
that is... it becomes very interesting as to what would have happened.
Yeah.
Like, because Morgan, how much longer were they in business?
I'm not sure, because they did Phantom's Revenge at Kennywood.
Yeah, it looked like, according to Wikipedia, as I've just pulled it up, they went defunct in 2001. So it seems like I wonder if they had succeeded in, and that's, I think maybe they may have merged with Chance then, maybe? I don't remember exactly the history, but I wonder if the history of Morgan would have been different had they gotten the Cedar Fair contract.
Yeah, it's one of those like big what ifs in the amusement industry. Like, if Morgan had built Millennium Force, they wouldn't have built Steel Dragon 2000. So would Intamin have actually built Steel Dragon, or like what are the dominoes that would have fallen after that?
Yeah.
Would be interesting.
Would the cable lift have still shown up at some point a few years later somewhere, or would Intamin have just shelved it? And I guess Steel Dragon even today holds a bunch of records. I mean, it's the longest roller coaster in the world, right?
Yep, as far as I know, yes. 8,000 something feet long. It's crazy.
Then I guess does also make you wonder, would Morgan have tried to build something that large for Cedar Point if or was part of the reason that their bid was so much higher because they were planning to make a much larger roller coaster? Yeah,
that's what I was saying. Like, it would be so interesting to see like the design that they proposed.
Yeah, how it compares. So maybe it's like the sort of an interesting process of getting the coaster built and some fun little controversy afterwards. How has, from like all of the research that you did, how has sort of like I guess maybe the legacy of Millennium Force like lived on? Like, it's 20 years later since it opened. Is it still? I mean, it still obviously is like one of not very many Giga Coasters and close to the top of a bunch of those records. What else in its sort of history over that 20 years was like notable as you were researching it?
I think one of the, like, why it's so beloved by a lot of enthusiasts is just the time period it was built, being at like kind of the dawn of the internet and blogging and coaster forums gaining popularity, and like being able to actually follow the construction online and talking to other, finding out there were other coaster enthusiasts out there like you, and connecting on the internet for like probably the first time for a lot of people, and kind of bonding over watching this huge new ride go up. So I think that's kind of that like nostalgia factor is one of the reasons why it has that legacy that it does. The design of the coaster itself, just that the iconic look of it. That's another thing. Like if Morgan had built it, it would probably have looked a lot like Steel Dragon, or it would have looked like even Magnum does it. Cedar Point, just maybe colored blue. So I think that's another like good thing why Intamin got the contract, was just the sleek design, and like that lift hill is so iconic. Like you can sketch it out, and like you can be like, "What coaster is that?" And like any coaster enthusiast can tell you, "Oh, that's Millennium Force," because that just the profile of the lift hill is so iconic.
So one of the most interesting things that I remember reading in the article was you were talking about on the like opening day. Lines were, I guess newspapers were exaggerating super long lines, and the park sort of tried to do kind of a virtual queue type thing. Can you tell me a little bit about what that was?
Yeah, since the lines were so long when the ride opened, because it was so popular, they tried a ticket to ride, which was kind of an appointment system. I guess they did it for the first few weeks in June, so guests could come and get a ticket to return during a specific time frame. But I guess there were issues with this ticket because of weather, or the ride would have some maintenance issues and be down, and then that would kind of screw the whole thing up. Or there were those guests that were like trying to sell the tickets within the park to other people. So, because I guess it was just maybe like a paper system. At one point, I thought they did like a hand stamp or something like that, but
yeah,
I'm not sure. But
it's so interesting to me because it's basically what like Disney does with Rise of the Resistance, or Universal was doing with Hagrid's, that it's essentially the same idea, except that now we have a way to both actually attach the appointment is attached to your account or your ticket, and we can give you something where we update the time that you have to return when you're actually allowed to return. But it's essentially the exact same idea as what big parks are using on rides now. That's very interesting to me that they had the idea but kind of didn't have the technology to make it work.
This went from
20 years ago.
From papers to smartphones.
So I guess I assume that you're a fan of Millennium Force, right?
Yeah. I think there's better roller coasters in terms of ride dynamics, but it's still I think it's one of the most important roller coasters that's been built. And there's just something about it. It's Millennium Force, Yeah.
I think it's interesting that you talked about the importance of its legacy with early in the internet, because I think that is, so I went to Cedar Point for the first time in, I want to say 2008, 2007, 2008. And a lot of my reason for knowing that Cedar Point existed, even though I have spent basically my whole life in California, was from watching, Travel Channel shows about the biggest roller coasters and best roller coasters. And in the 2000s, Millennium Force was always number one on all of those because it was the newest, biggest roller coaster. So there's certainly, I think, in terms of my interest, love of it is, I think, like you said, kind of rooted in that nostalgia. What are some of the things that people criticisms about it now, either that existed 20 years ago or that are things that have come as it's kind of been around for that long and surpassed a little bit maybe by other roller coasters?
I think one of the negative aspects that people talk about of it is basically the same of any large Giga Coaster, Hyper Coaster, giant roller coaster, is that just the scale of the elements are so large in order to keep the G-forces in check, and it's expensive to build those giant elements that a lot of these Giga Coasters don't really have very many elements. So I think if you count on Millennium Force, it has maybe 8 elements. If you count the lift hill as 1, then the first overbank is 2, then the next hill is 3. It's basically 4 hills and 4 overbank turns.
Yeah.
So there's other smaller roller coasters that, if you count all the elements, maybe have 15 or 20. So you're doing a lot more up and down and inversions and crazy stuff in a shorter time period. So those smaller rides can be much more dynamic than those giant Giga Coasters. But what the Giga Coasters have going for them is that giant first drop.
Yeah. That's an experience that, as you were describing that, I was thinking of another Intamin ride at Cedar Point, Maverick. Oh, it's low to the ground the whole time, but is completely packed with elements, right? But it is sort of, you can't get the experience of that lift hill and that first drop without having a giant 300-foot roller coaster.
Yeah. Plus, overbank turns aren't that exciting, and that's half the ride. It's one right overbank turn to the right, overbank turn.
Do you think that? We earlier in the summer, the last episode you were on, we talked about Orion Giga Coaster at Kings Island, the new one this year. Do you think that Giga Coasters have, I know that that's been sort of a similar complaint with Orion, but do you think that have Giga Coasters have they improved noticeably in the 20 years? Do they still have that same problem, or have companies started to figure out ways to make it maybe a little more dynamic through a ride?
Um, I think if you're looking at Orion, it has the same issue. I think on Orion actually has one less element. I think it has the fewest elements out of any of the Giga Coasters. But I look at something like Fury 325, and I think that's like the best Giga Coaster out there because it does more. Like even if the element count is less, like if you that second hill on Fury 325, it's not just like up and down or an overbank. It kind of banks to the left, then back to the right, then back to the left. So I think Fury. I think is a little bit different in that it's more dynamic. It does a little bit more with the track that it has.
Do you think, I guess maybe sort of a last question about kind of the ride experience for Millennium Force. Do you agree with Morgan that the ride has a lot of energy going into the station that it just has to trim on the brakes? I was sort of, because it's been a few years since I've ridden it, so I was trying to like watch POVs and be like, oh, it does still feel like it could do a lot more towards the end.
Yeah, and I mean, you want to have that balance where you don't want to just slowly crawl into the station.
Have it peer out,
You also don't want to come in at 60 miles per hour. So I think, it would be cool if it had, one or two more airtime hills or something like that to help burn off some speed and give you a little more airtime.
Backstretch. I guess so. Maybe the last thing on it then. What's your overall feeling about Millennium Force? Maybe I'll ask if there were any other sort of like things you learned when researching it that sort of surprised you or interested you about the construction process and the ride's history.
One thing that I learned was it's actually often incorrectly reported that Millennium Force was the first roller coaster to use magnetic braking, but it was actually another Intamin coaster, Superman Ride of Steel at Darien Lake, opened in 1999, was the first one to use magnetic brakes because Intamin first used that technology on the freefall tower that was at Kentucky Kingdom, or Six Flags Kentucky Kingdom at that time. And then they first put it on the coaster at Superman Ride of Steel at Darien Lake in 99, which, a new coaster at Darien Lake probably wasn't getting much press at that time, especially without all the internet and the bloggers that we have nowadays.
Right.
So it's probably easy to overlook that.
Yeah, so I guess, last thing then, what are your thoughts on Millennium Force today as a coaster?
Living in Ohio here, I feel like it's still like a rite of passage for people. Like, have you been on Millennium Force? So there's still just that nostalgia factor, and like when you go to Cedar Point and you're driving up the causeway, that's one of the first things you see is bam, Millennium Force right there in front of you. So it's just like, I think it's got to be one of the most like important roller coasters. I think probably one of the best decisions by a park to ever, when deciding to build a new roller coaster. I think that's one of the most important decisions Cedar Point has made, because Millennium Force is going to be one of the more popular roller coasters out there.
Yes, even today. I mean, that's certainly like I said, that's one of the reasons that I first went to Cedar Point, and I do feel like every time I go, I mean, there's the view from the lift hill and top of the hill is still, have a hard time thinking of a better view from a roller coaster, and like you'd said, the kind of aesthetic of the structure of it and that Intamin kind of track design, I think makes it very iconic on the Cedar Point skyline, even today, as there are lots of other roller coasters at Cedar Point that like are big and impressive on the skyline. I feel like Millennium Force is still the one that is the iconic Cedar Point roller coaster, right?
Yeah, it's like the one your eyes are drawn to.
Yeah, cool. Anything else you want to add, Nick?
I think that's it.
All right, great. Well, that's it for today then. Anyone should, if you head to Coaster101.com and search Millennium Force, Nick's 20 in 2020 article should be one of the top hits for Millennium Force.
Oh, I just want to say there's links to all the resources I listed actually in the article, and any that I may have forgotten, they're all in the article with links.
Yes, and there are lots of references to lots of good books and articles that you dug out for these. Certainly, you should also check out all of our other features on Roller Coaster celebrating their 20th anniversaries this year, which you can also find if you search for 20 in 2020, I think is the key phrase that we use in all of them. Let us know what your thoughts on Millennium Force are. You can email us podcast@coaster101.com or find us on all social media @coaster101. We'd love to know if you've got any other questions about Millennium Force or other historically important rides. Let us know. Or if you think Millennium Force is great or terrible, let us know that too. Thank you to JM Music Design, as always, for our theme song. And we will be back next week. Thanks, Nick.
Thank you.